Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our final panel moderator. Following the panel, we will have some closing remarks and then some meze outside, and we will follow that with our closing event for the evening, which will be a screening of Looming Tower, along with a discussion between Lawrence Wright and Ali Soufan. So certainly from here on out is the home stretch, but all very, very much worth the wait. It is my pleasure to turn this over to Bobby Ghosh, a member of the editorial board of Bloomberg and a columnist focused on the Middle East, North Africa, and the wider Islamic world. He has been a journalist for more than 3 decades, with stints at Time Magazine, CNN, and Quartz, amongst others, in the process picking up a fantastic sense of style.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for sticking through a long day. I congratulate you on your decision to stay through the long day because we have now finally the best panel of this entire conference. And as well as also one of the most interesting topics of the conference. So I promise you, I know you've had a nice lunch, but I promise you plenty of intellectual nourishment over the next hour and a half. The same rules as before. We'll have some individuals will make some presentations or remarks. I'll exercise the moderator's privilege by asking a couple of questions, and then we'll take questions from you. You know the email address. This is, in many ways, there's a reason why this is the last of the panels, because it is a culmination of all the discussions that have gone before. The moderator's job in this particular instance is to get out of the way of the intelligent conversation that is to follow. So I'm going to start immediately by inviting our speakers to make their presentations. I will be very brief in everything, including in the descriptions, because of course, these folks need no introduction to this group, but in case they do, you have their substantial bios in the folder that you got up front. We'll start by I'll start by asking Mia Bloom. Dr. Mia Bloom is a professor of communication at Georgia State University. She's best known for books and articles on terrorism and violent extremism, including Dying to Kill, the Allure of Suicide Terror, and Bombshell, Women and Terror. And on that introduction, Dr. Bloom.
Thank you so much for sticking around. It's I know I'm keeping you from a wonderful episode of Looming Tower, so I'll try to be succinct. All right, so today I was asked to do a bit of a deep dive into, we'll go one more, into children, women and children, which are, I have a new book that is in production now. It'll be available in March, called Small Arms, Children and Terrorism, in which I compare the children in the ISIS Cubs, Ashbal al-Khilafa, with children who are terrorist movements around the world. And it includes the field research I did in Pakistan, which I'll be happy to talk about in the Q&A. I want to talk just for a second because there is a bit of an overlap from, as Bobby mentioned, across the different panels. These are the most well-known women of ISIS, and except for the 3 American women in the middle, they're all dead. Now, the women, these, for example, Samra Kesinovic and Sabina Selimovic, were 15 and 16 years old, disappeared from Vienna to join Islamic State. They were all jihadi brides. And what's interesting is that when they wanted to leave and go home, they were killed. And so part of the reason that I want to start with this is I want us to think about in not so much a sympathetic way, but in a way that we understand that the roles that women and children played very often were complicated. And so as we are considering whether rehabilitation is possible, whether repatriation is possible, I wanted to start with the fact that these young girls are no longer with us. And the only ones that are still alive, for example, in the middle, the American girls, Jalen Young, Shannon Maureen Connolly, and Daniela Green, is because they were arrested at the airport and prevented from going. One of the major themes that we see across the different jihadi groups has been that you need to join the jihad to defend your sisters in Islam, that women in Iraq or in Afghanistan or wherever are being raped. This, I'm not going to go through this very long piece of propaganda, but this is from the UK. And this was Al-Qaeda propaganda to try to encourage men to join the jihad. And you see, I'm just going to read for you one piece of it. Our honor and our chastity have been violated. Our clothes have been torn. Our wombs are full of illegitimate children. We scream for help to save us. I urge you, if you have weapons, attack. This is a common theme because what they then did, and for Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda in Iraq, was to present to people all over the Middle East, in the Gulf, in North Africa, this idea that women at Abu Ghraib were being physically tortured or raped. And in fact, as you see from this first, I don't have a pointer, but in the first series, horrific images. Now, the State Department right away said that these images were fake. It took me 7 years. They were right. ISIS is using the same images. Those images are not American soldiers raping Iraqi women in Abu Ghraib. It's from Hungarian pornography. And it took me years no, I didn't watch a lot of porn. I did actually do the research. I wasn't personally watching the movies, but I did eventually find out that this image, even though we know it was fake, has been recycled, as you see. At the beginning of ISIS, they used the exact same imagery. Now, the idea is to cause so much outrage that men feel that they are not manly unless they go to defend their sisters in Islam. And it is one of the main motivating ways, not only that you shame a man into participating, but the women understand this and they use their gender and they use the idea of murwa, manliness, in their favor. But here is where we really started to notice children. In 2014 in the summer, Khalid Sharoof, because we're talking about foreign fighters, an Australian foreign fighter for ISIS, posted this picture to Twitter of his then 8-year-old son holding a severed head. And this, you can imagine, became a meme. Within hours, it was in every newspaper, it was on every channel, it was on CNN, Al Jazeera, every channel was showing this image. And it really shows us the extent to which children have been weaponized in the Islamic State. I have a selection because, again, with the focus on foreign fighters, the foreign fighter children. Now, what I like to do is called providing you the bottom line up front, the bluff. The reason is it's like getting dessert before dinner. I want to tell you what the main findings of the research is, and then the rest of the slides will confirm what I'm telling you. That ISIS, although not the only group to use children, was actually a late adopter. What is the most surprising is, as I go through each of the groups, every single group in Syria, including the groups that we think as being the good guys, including the groups that have been funded by the United States, exploited children on the front lines. There are no good guys. The second thing is that ISIS was a bit of a late adopter, but once they started using children, they increased exponentially the number of kids that they were exploiting. Interestingly enough, there are significant differences even within ISIS between Iraq and Syria, the extent to which they used children, how they used children, and the types of children they used. And then finally, at the end today, I'm going to talk to you about some of the DDR potentials. What are the possibilities of rehabilitation and reintegration to society? And Francesca and I were talking about this last night, that I vehemently disagreed with the Iraqi officer who said these children are lost. Having been at a facility in Pakistan where children have been rehabilitated, I can tell you, they're not lost. It's not too late. It's complicated, it's expensive, it requires a great deal of programming, but it is possible to make these children have a happy and productive life. Now, based on the work that Sir Richard Barrett did for the Sufan Group, what I did is just to give you an idea, if you were to look at foreign fighters, the adults, you see a fairly good distribution across the globe. If I'm looking at children across all the groups, again, a little bit more limited. And here's the interesting part. This is just, this is just ISIS. We couldn't find a Tunisian child among the foreign fighters. Now, we're counting not kids who have been trained, but kids who have been eulogized on the networks, and so unfortunately they're no longer with us, which is why I can show you their images. What that said to me is that the Tunisians who went in great numbers, as much as 3,500 Tunisians, got married and may have had kids. And we know that there are kids now in the facilities, but these kids didn't show up and weren't there long enough in order to be weaponized. Now, we do have some kids as young as 4 years old who were used in propaganda, who actually were involved in the killing of adults. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that, but part of what I wanted to do in the deep dive is to talk to you about the psychology. So we look at the social ecology of children in Islamic State by looking theoretically in psychology at Bronfenbrenner's social ecology, that children are nested within layers of social ecology, within family, within their peer network, within school, and then within the state. And at each of these layers, there are possibilities for intervention to save the children. One of the things we looked at is school. So I collected from the Islamic State the textbooks that they used in English and in Arabic. It is worth mentioning that the first year of the Islamic State, they didn't have their own textbooks. They used Saudi textbooks because ideologically they were almost indistinguishable. But they eventually changed the Saudi textbooks, and you can see that at every level, the books are militarized. Now, this is a grade 2 math book, and you can see that the children are counting guns and tanks and weapons. But this one is my favorite. This is how we learn to tell time. The clock is attached to TNT. And this, again, also grade 2. So at every level, the children have been imbued with militarized images, with making violence and war completely normal. We have 9- and 10-year-olds who are taught to drive for the sole purpose of being able to drive a suicide car bomb, and Francesca showed us some of those live images. As well as if a child was particularly articulate, ISIS was talent spotting. So the child would actually be on the Dawah caravan with, his microphone, convincing the adults, in the same way that using women as a way of goading men into participating, using children shames men that the child is doing something that the adults should be doing. They even put children in the pulpit in Jam'ah on a Friday, where they were addressing the people who were assembled in the mosque. Again, to try to say, we are children and we are willing to fight for the Islamic State. What are you willing to do? So, as I mentioned, I charted all of the use of ISIS child bombers and martyrs from 2014 until 2017. You could see that there's a slow uptick. Interestingly enough, there is, in political science, we would call it a substitution effect. After the loss in battle, within a month, we would see an increased use of children. Interestingly enough, the foreign children, especially from Western countries, but a mix, were used in propaganda repeatedly. In this video, in May of 2016, 100%, which I thought ISIS can't possibly be that clever, because it means blood for blood, but if you say it fast, it also means 100%. I thought, oh, wow, that's very clever. They stole that from a Moroccan rapper. The same kids were then used in August as executioners of Kurdish prisoners. And if you read Arabic, you can see one is Egyptian, one is Jojo Jones from the UK, Sally Jones's son, and so on. These children, these foreign fighter children, appear over and over and over, and you saw from Francesca's film some of the videos where they're being trained. These were the United Colors of Benetton children. And they were used in order to convey the message, Islamic State is diverse. Look at the beautiful children. But we were also able to see the same children appearing repeatedly in propaganda, so they were not sacrificed, although in this one case on the top, those are two Yazidi brothers, ages 9 and 10, who after 2 years of being trained and brainwashed, in my opinion, became suicide car bombers. But this is really interesting for me. This is Abdallah. He's a Uzbek. You see him in 2013, 2014, 2015. And you see going from being by his father's side at a rally to executing a Russian FSB prisoner. And so these children will appear over and over again. What ISIS did was they determined which children were expendable, the local children, and which children were valuable, and in what way they held a value. I apologize for the compression. We also broke down, interestingly enough, 94 children in Syria who died in Syria. You can see the vast majority are either Syrian or they were called Ansari, meaning they could be either Syrian or Iraqi, but a few French, one French, Malaysian, Moroccan, one Palestinian. But in Iraq, very diverse, and I apologize, we compressed, but you have 286 children, not 94, and we had about 30 different nationalities. And this is the slide that I wanted to start with, and I want to make sure that it's burned into your memory. These are all the children who were used on the front lines, not as civilian casualties, but in the course of battlefield as martyrs. The lower black line is ISIS. The red line is the Free Syrian Army. And so we have SSNP, Hezbollah, the YPG, YPJ. This is why I say to you that ISIS was exploiting children, but not even the group that was exploiting the most. And since I wanted to try to end on a happy note, what are some of the lessons we learned from DDR? I was very fortunate to work with Tanya Zayed, who was Romeo Dallaire's assistant or second in command of the initiative for 8 years. Based on research having been done in Latin America and in Africa for years, as you know, General Dallaire, after surviving the Rwandan genocide, went on to found a very important child soldier initiative to bring children who had been in these conflicts back to society. What we learned was that initiatives that are spearheaded that by states have a better success rate because there's also local ownership. So while the international community can do things, the local communities can have the best impact. That the DD of DDR is a little bit more successful than the reintegration part. Reintegration requires buy-in, and so it becomes very difficult when the communities don't want the children back. And of course, the African militias understood this. This is why the first action that many of the child soldiers had to do in African militias was kill members of their own family so that the extended family would never want them back and would reject them. So it is very important that as we understand the Bronfenbrenner social ecology, the children are nested within layers: family, state, peers, school. We can't exclude one layer from the next, which makes the suggestion by the French of accepting the children and not the parents particularly problematic. That also, the DDR programs have to be gender specific. I love this photo of a girl in ISIS who's finally been liberated and she can take off her niqab. We have programs that exist. More often they're for adults, very few programs for children, and even fewer for girls. This is where I get the data. As you see, ISIS doesn't like me. I'm apparently not slave market worthy. But I collected the data from their encrypted platforms on Telegram. And so This is why we cross-reference the information that ISIS is advertising about the children with actual reports, especially with the foreign fighter children, because these would be reported if it's an Australian, like Jake Bellardi, it would be in the Australian newspaper. So there's a lot of data we talked about data yesterday, so we make sure to validate the data on in different ways. Here are some of the programs that have been established in the Middle East. In blue are the ones that address specifically children. Now, I spoke today with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Some programs that are preventative are about teaching children not to become radicalized, which is fantastic, but those are very different from programs that are actually dealing with children who have blood on their hands. And so what I use as a template, I spent several months going back and forth to Pakistan in Fatah area in Malakand, an organization called Sabaun, and I have to move on. I have to move on. All right, so let me just say, Sabaun is very successful, and it's a great template, and I can tell you more about it in the Q&A.
Well, I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions for this. But we're going to move on to Fabrizio Carboni. Fabrizio is the Regional Director for Near and Middle East at the Red Cross, having previously been head of the ICRC delegations in Lebanon and Myanmar. Fabrizio.
Okay. But thank you first for giving me this opportunity to present the ICRC perspective on this, the situation of foreign fighters. So our perspective is mainly a field perspective. It's conflict perspective. It's based on our experience over the last decades where we visited these foreign fighters in prison, but also we dealt with them in the field. You know, for us, our capacity to talk to all parties to a conflict, it's our security. We have no military escort. It's just our capacity to deal, to make them understand our mission, how we work, how we function, which guarantees our security. Today, we focus mainly on Iraq and Syria. We visit foreign women, children, and fighters, men. We visit them in prison, in IDP camps, and orphanages. What I found interesting is that 80% of the people we visit are women and children, and most of them are below 5. So what we do, we monitor the condition of detention, we provide material assistance to make sure that they live in decent conditions, we establish contact between them and their family, and if they want, we notify their presence to their country of origin. So that was the easiest part of my presentation, because as ICRC, we often find ourselves in a place where we need to defend the undefendable. And I believe that over the last 2 days, I think it's quite clear to everybody. We're talking about very bad people. I mean, foreign fighters, by the way, we're not talking about foreign fighters. We are talking about Islamic State and to some extent, Jabhat al-Nusra. We're not talking about people joining YPG. We're not talking about private security companies. We're not talking about this. We're talking about ISG and Jabhat al-Nusra situation. And I think it's important to be clear about this. So we understood they are very bad guys. Women, yeah, maybe some of them can be saved, but they are also very bad. And kids, below 10 years old, maybe there is something to be saved, but below 10 years old, nothing. So what we need to say as ICRC is that even very bad people have the right to be protected. You know, and as ICRC, we are obviously promoting the international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict. And this is really a law which protects very basic rights, very basic, you know, physical integrity, the right not to be killed once you are hors combat, the right not to be tortured, and in theory, and due process, that's a really important one. And in theory, all these rules are non-negotiable. I mean, all the states, save Cook Island, but I don't think Cook Island is in the room today. all the states committed to this rule, and they all accepted that they would be unilateral, and that military necessity and security are already integrated into this rule. So in theory, there is no compromise. That makes me feel better, just to say it. Now, we also know that that's not reality. I mean, as ICRC delegates, we would not survive, we would not be a relevant organization if we just stopped there. We know that we have to compose with security. And states have a right, have not just a right, have a duty to protect their citizen, their territory from any kind of threat. The problem with security, and especially when we talk about terrorism, it's hard to define sometimes. And I believe that's the whole idea of terrorism. You know, it's terror. It's not always based on objective facts. And actually, sometimes I say to myself, you know what? To some extent, they won. You know, to some extent, they won because the fear we have in, for instance, the Western states regarding terrorism goes way beyond the reality of the risk. You know, I never saw friends talking about, you know, the fear of dying on the highway, which is way higher than to die from a terrorist attack. But fine. And that's something we need to take into consideration, and we do as ICRC. The second element, and this one is way more complicated, it's the political dimension. I mean, appetite for risk, especially in the political sphere, is very low these days. And very few states or very few politicians can stomach a risk, which is to show compassion for an enemy, forget about bringing them back. But this is the challenge we need to face. So if, as ICRC, if you want to be relevant, we have to carve a humanitarian space, considering all these elements. And it's not always easy. So there are few things we ask states. I mean, first of all, you know, just be specific, take into consideration the specific vulnerabilities of people. Talking about children, you know, making this difference below 5, above 5, below 10, you know what? No. Make no discrimination based on age. You know, just look at the kids, you know, pay attention to the individuals. I mean, I won't thank you enough for your movie because, you know, that's our reality as ICRC. That's what we are experiencing every day, is this reality of kids, women, and I'm man also, which you cannot capture into the, you know, very political, conceptual approach to security. And when you deal with this reality, it's hard to accept that kids are covered into, you know, broad category. That's not our reality, and that's not the reality of those people. So really, kids make no distinction based on age, and I think actually it's quite reassuring what you just said about that there is hope for them. The second thing are women. As ICRC, I mean, we are very clear. You commit war crimes, genocide, whatever, you are prosecuted. And we ask and we demand state to prosecute. That's one thing. The second thing is to take into consideration after the situation of these women. For the ones who are prosecuted, but also the ones who are not, and who are stigmatized, as we saw again in your movie. Most of them, you know, when you stigmatize, you isolate it, you're vulnerable, and we really have a challenge around sexual violence. We really have difficulties to address this issue, and we know for a fact that those women are terribly exposed to sexual violence. The third one are the fighters. As we said, prosecute. That's your duty. That's your obligation. But due process. Don't transfer responsibility to other actors who have a lower threshold. Don't lower judicial guarantee. Individual criminal responsibility, no collective criminal responsibility. Demonstrate the facts. We see a trend which is really worrying, where due process is not respected at all. The final one are the families of these foreign fighters. We saw several cases where families who tried to know the whereabouts of their loved one, who tried to contact them to know where they are, what was happening to them, were after, they had problem with some security services. And really believe that that's something which should not happen. Families have a right to know. We all have a right to know what happened to our loved ones, even if our loved ones are considered as the worst criminal. You need to know. Related to this also, it's the issue around family. We have a lot of the cases of kids. We're pushing for the children to be repatriated to their country of origin. But we want them to be repatriated with their family, with their mothers. We know it's a very contentious issue today. But again, connecting this to your issue of rehabilitation, even if the woman, the mother is prosecuted, you still have better chance to rehabilitate the child if you bring them back together. Our colleagues in the field have seen things, children being separated by their mother by force. You don't want to go through this. You really don't want to go through this. Just to finish, I think it was said several times, I think to some extent war is won in Iraq, at least against IS for the time being. But now it's about peace. It's about winning peace. Unfortunately, my experience is not very good at that. It's 20 years that I'm working the ICRC. In all the countries at war where I worked, all of them are still at war, save one. And I believe the way we're going to deal with foreign fighters, but beyond the foreign fighter, but let's be clear, foreign fighter is just a small fraction of the dramatic humanitarian situation in places like Iraq and Syria. If we want to have a chance, just a small chance, to offer a more peaceful and stable future to those people, it's to do the right thing with these foreign fighters. It won't be enough. It really won't be enough. But that's really a good place to start.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio. Francesca, Mannocchi, I'm sure most of you were here last night to see that astonishing documentary that she's produced. What you might not know is that she's also a journalist and has covered conflicts and wars and migration crises across the Middle East and in Turkey and in Libya and Egypt. And so she's someone sort of deeply enlightened on the topic of the day. And it'll be interesting to hear a different perspective from that of a researcher and a Red Cross person.
Thanks again for having me here. I would like to start with a picture. This one. In recent year, I worked extensively in Iraq to complete the documentary As Is Tomorrow, but I also cover a lot what's happening in Libya. And this is an image of Sirte War, which was a war against ISIS, again, a war less covered by the international media, but in my opinion, I was there more brutal in some aspect than the other, than Raqqa and Mosul. Because the unofficial mandate of the soldier on the ground was, we won't take any prisoner. And they didn't. And this picture was taken the day before the war was declared over. And this guy was killed right in front of our eyes. We were in Al-Jizza neighborhood, the neighborhood in the last pocket of ISIS fighter in front of the sea in Sirte, the Gaddafi city. And there were inside still 50, 100 fighters. They bombed all the day after. And the Libyan soldier killed this guy in front of us. And if you know this guy, this our shoulder of a doctor was clapping his hands to Libyan soldier. Why I'm showing this picture? Because this picture shows a war crime. How is it possible that soldiers allowed journalists and photographers to portray a war crime? He was disarmed, of course, this fighter. I just can't talk about the responsibility of media because I'm a journalist. And what I can say is that we describe ISIS fighters, ISIS families, ISIS members, not like human beings, but like just a black monolith who deserve no mercy. And this is exactly the consequences we're paying their families now. The families of foreign fighters, both families of affiliated in Iraq and Syria and Libya and elsewhere. I studied philosophy, so I just like to quote Wittgenstein as we were talking this morning. Words are actions, and words are actions. And the words we repeatedly listen in the field, in the war against ISIS, were kill them all and annihilation. Annihilation is not just a word, it's a strategy of punishment. If you look at the cities today, Raqqa, Sirte, Mosul, they are not just defeated, they have been punished because the population inside, in the eyes of the international coalition, deserved a punishment, a lesson, not to repeat their mistakes again. I show you this picture of Sirte because the majority of the fighters in Sirte, just to show you that the same happened in Mosul, in Iraq. These are Iraqi soldiers, and as you have seen yesterday in the documentary, it's happened the same. They just taken him away, and when I asked what about the prisoner, they were just miming. That's the answer. I show you the picture of Sirte because the majority of the fighters in Sirte were Tunisian. And as I told you yesterday, I want to read the transcript of a piece of the interview I have done with a consultant of Essebsi, the Tunisian president. I was just asking about their strategy on the children of foreign fighters, and he told me, "We have no solution. How can we explain to the Tunisian citizens who are struggling with unemployment that we are spending money on the radicalization programs of foreign fighters and their children? Those guys have chosen to create another country, rejecting the Tunisian one. They wanted to tear up their passport and print another passport in a new state, the Islamic State. Let them stay there, in prison or in orphanages. This problem is not our problem, it's their problem." And this is the official position of the consultant of the Tunisian government. Where are now the sons of the Tunisian fighter? They are here in a facility in Misrata. This is a group of Eritrean and Tunisian women, sex slaves of ISIS fighters and their children. And they now are there, basically rejected by everyone, and Tunisian government is not working to bring them back. They are working not to bring them back. And now, Iraq. What's happening in Iraq? There are this rehabilitation camp. It's quite bizarre, call them rehabilitation camp. The one I show you in the documentary is Al-Jadda camp that now hosts around 60,000 people, more or less. And there is another camp, and there's at least a school. There's another camp, which is Al-Sham camp near Tikrit, 130 kilometers west of Mosul. There's no school, any kind of rehabilitation program. The Iraqi government has not yet approved the United Nations team to investigate war crimes committed by the Iraqi army, and not only Iraqi army, the militia, like the Popular Mobilization Forces, Al-Shab, during and after the battle against Daesh. Again, the Iraqi authorities are not informing, as Fabrizio was saying before, family members of the location of detainees, whether they are in prison, in camps, or screening site, wherever. They are not giving any kind of information to their families. It doesn't matter if their husbands or father or sons or brother were cooking in the Islamic State or were just, assassins. Doesn't matter. Again, Iraqi authorities never made public the number of fighters and civilians they are detaining. And just another example, the last one. In February and March, I don't remember exactly, the local armed forces in the district of Al-Baj, northern Iraq, issued an order, a decree, saying that no Mukhtar, no sheikh, no one should be allowed to stamp the document of ISIS families, of ISIS affiliated. So if these families have no paper from intelligence, from Mukhtar, they are not allowed to attend school, they cannot cross the checkpoint, they cannot freely move inside the city, they have no security papers, they are not allowed to have food assistance or medical assistance. So what? To close. As journalists, as narrator, as director, as people working in the media, we have a responsibility. We have the responsibility of a narrative which is different, which is narrative of listening before, of telling in another way, of listening with unbiased mind in front of these people. Talking just about my recent experience with this documentary, having access to those people was very, very difficult. But once there, the key word was just listening. They need to be listened without judgment and without prejudice. If we don't do that, we cannot solve the problem of counter-narrative on ISIS. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabrizio. And last and certainly not the least, Dr. Rohan Gunaratana. Rohan is Professor of Security Studies at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang University and Head of International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research in Singapore. He's an author of 16 books, including Inside Al-Qaeda, a Global Network of Terror. Rohan, take it away.
There are three significant developments that are taking place. One is 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 expanding globally. Certainly their battle space has shrunk in Iraq and Syria, but we are seeing the huge IS expansion in parts of the Middle East, in Africa, and in Asia. This global expansion, if you look at Africa, from Nigeria to parts of Niger, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, from Libya, Algeria to Sahel, from the eastern parts of Africa, we are seeing that in Somalia they have created cells, and that is affecting the developments in Kenya and also Puntland. In the case of Yemen, certainly IS is not the most dominant actor, but it is again expanding. And in the Caucasus, very small presence. In the Balkans, certainly yes. In Pakistan and Afghanistan, IS is growing. And certainly Afghanistan is likely to become the most important theater after Iraq and Syria. Most recently, we have seen an expansion of IS into the eastern edge of Asia, the East Asia Vilayat. So the first and the most significant development is that it is true that IS has suffered significantly in Iraq and Syria. But the next phase, the next 1 to 2 years, we will see very significant growth in those regions. Second is that IS has made headway in cyberspace, although the technology companies are working very hard and working very closely with governments. The third development is the participation of women and children. And I want to share a few examples based on our own experience in the Asian region. In May of this year, we witnessed entire families mounting suicide attacks. More than a dozen families had been radicalized. 2 families staged attacks. 1 family, the father was assembling the device and there was an explosion. And IS has institutionalized radicalization, meaning their classes are conducted for women and children. This is not in Syria and Iraq. This is in their vilayats and in territories where they have built significant networks. So certainly whatever investment we do in rehabilitation is going to help us. And I want to focus on rehabilitation because this conference, we all spoke about the need for rehab, but I think that the rehab model was not discussed. So I thought that I will break protocol and share with you the different modes of rehabilitation. How do you rehabilitate a terrorist? Singapore has built a very significant program. But I want to say that there are other countries that have also built very good programs. And the contemporary rehabilitation enterprise was started by the British in Malaya to fight the communists. The second rehab program was started in Kenya by the British again to rehabilitate Mau Mau insurgents. And of course, when in the 1990s, Egypt, Al-Gama al-Islamiyah, Al-Jihad al-Islamiyah, both these groups, there were very significant rehabilitation programs. And based on the study of most recent programs, I want to share with you some of the work that we have done, the Specialist Terrorism Research and Training Center at NTU, what we have done, because we have shared our rehabilitation capabilities with countries in Africa, in the Middle East, and in Asia. And I want to share with you that rehabilitation, using religious and spiritual rehabilitation is one of the most effective modes of rehabilitation. So in this, government has to work with the Ministry of Religious Affairs and work with clerics, but not only government clerics, but independent clerics. Independent cleric may have more traction than a government cleric. Second is, a cleric means you cannot just send a cleric to a prison because a cleric will start to talk You have to train the cleric to listen. So every cleric who does rehabilitation must have at least a very basic training in counseling. The second mode of rehabilitation is educational rehab. Teachers are very patient. So we have to send teachers to prison. Not only government teachers, but from the private schools. It can be one of their contributions. Another is social and family rehabilitation. This is central because the family unit must be preserved when the breadwinner is in custody or the key fighter. And so government should work with the NGOs and the social workers to keep those units, family units, intact. Because once you release the male prisoner back to the family, there must be a conducive environment for him to coexist. Another is sports and recreational rehab. Another is creative arts in rehab, song, dance, music, puppetry. And another is vocational rehab. In Sri Lanka, the Tamil Tigers, to rehabilitate them, government built a very effective program. And at that point, government asked me to speak to the blue chip companies. So we got the 10 top companies in the country, myself, Minister of Justice, and the Army Chief. We spoke to them because these companies were afraid to put industries in the rehabilitation centers. You see, because, and also they don't want to employ any terrorist who's been released from custody. So we had to engage the top businesses. And I want to tell you that those businesses set up agriculture, farming, fishery, driving, computers. And 12,000 fighters were reintegrated. Finally, I want to share with you about psychological rehab. Psychologists are expensive. In the Western world, it may be different, but in Asia, Africa, Middle East, difficult to employ so many psychologists. So there are programs that are developed to train counselors, and these counselors have been very effective. They can work with psychologists to remove that hatred in the heart. I think yesterday's film very clearly demonstrated that we are not doing the right thing. That is, we have to restore those children, those women back to their status. By labeling them IS, we will fail. We should not even call them, even if we have a male terrorist or a female terrorist or a child of a terrorist, we should not use the word terrorist. They may be terrorists, but we use the term beneficiaries so that they feel that they are benefiting from the program. Let me share with you that if you do not rehabilitate, there are three things that will happen. There are three things that will happen. One is the terrorist will pose a threat. He will go and conduct these attacks because the ideology remains intact. Second is that person will infect others with that ideology. Third is that person will be hailed as a hero, as an icon by their sympathizers and supporters. So terrorist rehabilitation, insurgent rehabilitation is a global imperative. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rohan. Please start sending me some questions. Questions at foreignfightersandreturnees.com. Thank you all for sort of setting the stage for a very absorbing discussion. I want to start by asking each of you very briefly, in 2 or 3 sentences, to say, in your experience, who is doing rehabilitation well and why? What element of that rehabilitation strikes you as particularly useful and effective? You mentioned Pakistan earlier. Would you expand on that a little bit?
The program that I was talking about is called Sabaun, which is Urdu for the first rays of dawn's light. And I visited the facility several times over about 2-3 years. They take a 3-pronged approach. As you can imagine, when the army was able to push back the Pakistani Taliban out of Fatah and Malakand, which are the areas where Malala Yousafzai was shot, one of the things that upset the people was the Pakistani Taliban took away their music. They love the music and they love festivals, and so this was brought back. But when the army discovered that there were many children that the Taliban had kidnapped or had coerced families to hand over as a form of extortion, they took everyone under 16 and they said, we can save these kids under 16. And if they were over 16, they went to a rehabilitation facility, which is also a prison. What Sabaun does is it's a three-pronged approach. First, to get the children back to their educational level that is appropriate for their age. The second thing is vocational skills, to teach them something other than how to cut off a head or blow up a suicide bomb. And then the third thing, which was very important, was bringing in imams to teach them about the Islamic faith properly, not the interpretation that the Taliban had given them. I'm going to disagree with one thing. I think the expectation that you can change hearts and minds is setting a very high bar. I think the initial goal can be to change behavior. If you change behavior, you've done a great job. You can have people think whatever they want to think. As was mentioned in earlier panels today, you know, we have various freedoms enshrined in the American Constitution, freedom of expression, and you can freedom of thought. So being radical isn't the problem. But acting as a violent radical is the problem. So if you can just take away the incentives and off-ramp people so that they can have happy, productive lives. The thing that struck me about Francesca's film was I kept thinking, you know, where is the dignity and where is the hope? It is the lack of dignity and hope that is a driver. And so these are the things that Pakistan has addressed.
Fabrizio, in your, you worked in Myanmar, you worked in Lebanon, across the Middle East. Anyone striking you as doing something interesting, something worth being optimistic about?
I mean, first, as ICRC, read rehabilitation.
That's not your job, I recognize.
So that's why.
But you will have interacted with people.
Yeah, but usually we don't move into the rehabilitation phase because, we try to be seen as a neutral actor in a conflictual environment. And if we are seen as supporting one party to the conflict, we won't be neutral anymore. What I see, it's hope and dignity. I often see that military operations are successful, and it stops there. I mean, I give you an example, Iraq. It's 30 years that we are in Iraq. The battle in Mosul is won. For the first time in 30 years, we are underfunded in Iraq. What it means that military objective achieved, then what comes after, it's less of a priority. It's a political issue. So you need to win the peace. I mean, that's something we really need to address this issue because we're failing systematically.
Yesterday, in our discussion after the film, you mentioned that there was a rehabilitation camp in Kurdistan. Is that right?
There's a prison.
Tell us a little more about that. What are they doing right that impressed you?
Inside this prison in Erbil, I mean, the children have their own room. They can watch TV. They are supported by psychologists. The behavior of Kurds authority with children is totally different than the central government, what central government is doing in the rehabilitation camp and in the prison. There are no, as Fabrizio can confirm, there are no clear number of underage detained, at least for us. There are no clear number of underage detainees or where exactly they are, for how long.
And the people in this prison in Erbil, are they all Kurdish?
No,
they're not. So the authorities are providing rehabilitation regardless of their ethnicity.
Yeah. And regard hope, there are not a lot, but some example of civil society activities in Iraq who need to be supported Because the only way, from my experience in the Middle East, to help people to dignify themselves is using words. It's the only weapon to win this war, is using words. And we need to ask ourselves, even as journalists and analysts and humanitarian organizations, are we still able to combat this war with words or not? And if not, we have to learn again to do that.
Rohan, you're not allowed to say Singapore.
I would say that there are a number of countries that have built good programs, but they have expertise in a particular mode of rehabilitation. I'll give you an example from a non-Muslim country, because there are a huge amount of terrorists who have come from non-Muslim groups, but we are focusing so much on Muslim groups. Let's take the case of Sri Lanka. They're mostly Hindus and Christians. The name of the group is Tamil Tigers. They perfected the suicide vest.
Also child soldiers, very early on. Yeah.
A pioneering group. And I want to share with you that the Singapore model was religious rehab. So our clerics in Singapore trained Sri Lankan personnel. But the Sri Lankans took that model and expanded it and called it religious and spiritual rehab. And they introduced something called mindfulness training or vipassana. You see, where once you do meditation, once you do yoga, once you do art of living programs, you even started to cooperate with authorities. You start to abandon violence, reject violence, express remorse, able to reflect on what happened. I'll give you one more example. In Pakistan, when I visited Sabawun and Rastun, I saw Talib. Talib means
student.
Yeah, Taliban boy. This boy is reading a book about Ali Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan. But when he was under the influence of Taliban, he never read that. So they were doing something called bibliotherapy. You see, having the right type of books. So I want to tell you that different countries have developed different prongs and they have speciality in those areas. And many of these countries are now sharing. For example, to build the Pakistan program, the psychologist Dr. Mal Hettiarachchi traveled from Sri Lanka and introduced the concept beneficiary. Told the Pakistanis, don't call them, ex-terrorist, call them beneficiaries. So I want to tell you there's a lot of sharing that is going on. But still, most governments are not into rehabilitation. This is, in my view, the biggest weakness in the full spectrum counterterrorism strategy. We have to invest more both in upstream fighting terrorism and also in rehab.
We've been talking too much and many of the panels have been talking about how to reintegrate, train the returning foreign fighters to reintegrate themselves into society. I put it to you that the harder challenge is to train the society to accept them. It's one thing to get people to a point where they express remorse for what they did. They reject the ideology, they reject the violence, they're ready to go back into society. And it's quite something else for the society to take them back. It's not unreasonable for people to be suspicious. I think in one of the previous panels, there was a parallel drawn between foreign fighters who've been rehabilitated and released with pedophiles. It's not unreasonable for people to be frightened for their own safety, the safety of their communities, their children. How do you get past that? I mean, how do you get people to accept these returnees? Or is it possibly maybe that's not even Maybe that's not possible. Maybe part of the solution is to treat this like a witness protection program. Give these people new identities, send them to neighborhoods where they did not previously live and start a new life rather than plug back into an old one. You want to start with that?
The Colombia program that rehabilitated people who'd been in FARC, which is the Colombia Revolutionary Group that was active for many years, as well as Sabaun, in the difference between the Colombia program and other programs, and Michael Tarnby is here, so he's definitely the expert on evaluating the programs, was the extent to which aftercare was used, so that it wasn't just like you catch them, you retrain them, and you release them, but almost like Alcohol Anonymous, where you go back and you make sure, and that the role of formers is something that we really haven't talked a lot about, but they provide an invaluable insight as a deterrent to others, but also as a way of having people share their experiences. And the best example I can think of actually comes from in the Bali bombing, when one of the leaders of the movement was arrested, and he was taken to jail. And of course, he's waiting to be tortured and raped, because of course this is what they had told him would happen. And on the first day, nothing happened. They came and they gave him a Quran. And on the second day, they came and they gave him a prayer rug. And on the third day, they gave him cigarettes. And when he was not tortured, and when, thank goodness, he was not raped, he thought, if they've lied to me about this, what else did the jihadis lie to me about? So I think that this is where, you have the opportunity, not just for the rehabilitation, but the rehabilitation needs to be in a very sophisticated fashion. It's not reprogramming. It's not that you're taking people out of a cult.
We are still talking about the fighters. How about the society into which they're supposed to go back?
And the society, understandably, is very nervous. The difference between success and failure is the society. Both in Pakistan, they have to spend a lot of time convincing people to let the fighters back in, but also in Nigeria with Boko Haram, Dr. Fatima Akilu has said that the difference between success and not success was, for example, in urban areas, they would accept the people back, but in the rural areas, they were much more nervous. So we have to understand that there's going to be differences regionally, but also differences between rural and urban. But you're absolutely right, Bobby. It is crucial to have the society understand the complicated nature of involvement, what it involved to get involved, and what it means to get out.
Rohan, the Sri Lanka example, these people go through the reintegration program. When they are released, do they go back to their original communities, or are they resettling somewhere where they can completely erase their past lives?
They went back to their original communities and some stayed outside. Give you one example. Government and private sector, mostly private sector, gave them jobs. So when a terrorist or a beneficiary returned back to the village with a job, another man came and said, "You killed my son and you have got a job. I have another son without the job." And asked the government, "Why have you given him a job?" So this is the question you raise is a very complex one, but it has to be addressed at different levels. That is why I always say that in parallel with rehab, we must have community engagement. So we have to constantly educate the communities. I also want to share with you that success of custodial rehabilitation, that is rehabilitation in prison or detention center, depends on community reintegration. If you don't follow up, if you don't measure whether the radicalization increase or decrease, it can be a failure.
By the way, I recognize that there's so much expertise in the audience. You don't only have to ask questions, you can also contribute to this conversation. If anybody has any specific thoughts about this particular aspect of sort of how to train communities, please write in just send me an email. That's the address again, questions@foreignfightersandreturnees.com. One or two people are raising hands. I can't get you a mic, so that won't work. Just write me an email, please. Yes, Fabrizio.
On this one, there are really a couple of things which we can, our experience in the ICRC, I don't say that it will address the society as a whole, but a couple of things which help, at least for society who knew war. I would not make the parallel between Iraq, Syria with Western countries who face terrorism. There, I think, in this case, is justice and the narrative media and politicians are building. For the countries at war, justice, that's clear, but not only for the losers, also for the winners when it's deserved. The other issue are the missing people. In many countries, there are hundreds of thousands of people who disappear during conflict. And our experience that the effort to reestablish contact, to work on the right to know of the family is really something which helps society overcome with time the tension. And the third one, which is applicable for Western country facing terrorism or conflict at war, it's the narrative. If your enemy becomes the devil, if your enemy is a terrorist for whatever he does, once you're at peace, it's a hard time to say, you know what, after all the terrible things we said, it's maybe not totally true. So I think words have such a weight in conflict. The word terrorist, I think, is used and misused. You know what happened to us in the ICRC very often? We meet both parties to a conflict, and they use exactly the same vocabulary when they talk about each other.
Yes.
We
saw that in the film yesterday, and we have to be mindful that this may not apply to the returning foreign fighters coming back to Europe or other communities, but in Iraq and in Syria, it's not unreasonable for the families of the victims to use those words against the families, or in some cases perpetrators. We can't judge them and condemn them for feeling hatred and anger, because their hatred and anger is justifiable. They have experienced and seen sort of bestial behavior that none of us have had to encounter. So it's very easy to say, that we should stop using these words, but those words reflect their lived experience. Francesca, I'm curious about what you think, the people that you met and in the context of your film. We don't hear any of them, on camera at least, expressing remorse. And I think as Rohan pointed out, without an expression of remorse, you can't start any kind of healing process. What will it take to get Noor, the young woman we saw yesterday, what will it take to get Noor to a point of remorse, where she recognizes that her husband was wrong, did horrible things that hurt other people, and that he was not some sort of a hero fighting for some noble cause?
We decided not to edit, of course, all the interview we've done, and to choose those one because we're completely different from the cliché stereotypes we are usually watching in TV or reading in magazine and newspaper. We usually portray this kind of people and organization following a category. So you have the repentant jihadist, and you have the sex slave who was raped inside the camp. And our challenge was try to give another account of the same situation. Surprisingly, no one of the person I've met was repented, regretful. And I tried because I wanted to listen. Why? First of all, they need to externalize the amount of violence they have normalized in their life. It's a long process. It's a long process. And then, talking with them, I've understood that they need an idea more than an ideology. This kind of organization, I don't want to tell terrorist, this kind of organization. And they rarely mention ISIS or Al-Qaeda. They say just, we are like that. This ideology, the idea, this is what we believe in, without mentioning, without giving a name to the organization. Doesn't matter the name, doesn't matter the logo, doesn't matter the color of the flag. Can change. Today will be our turn again. The ideology, the idea of a common, crucial, this word is crucial again, the word, a common, not an individual project, which bring me into the future, because I am part of a common project. And this is the reason why I think that employment, poverty, unemployment, social conditions are just part of the problem. It's a metaphysical problem. It's something that is related to the meaning of an individual life inside a whole society. The idea of a future for an individual, which belongs to a community.
So, but that makes it much harder for them to feel any remorse.
Yeah.
Impossible?
Yeah, possible.
I have a question. Magnus Ranstrup asks, and this might be something, Fabrizio, for you to look at. He asks, children in refugee camps in neighboring states to conflict zones, so in, let's say, in the Syrian case, Turkey, Jordan, and so on. He says these children seem to represent a lost generation. What are the dangers of radicalization? Are violent extremist groups recruiting in these camps, and what should we do about it?
I mean, I was in Lebanon for 4 years, and I heard this line very often. And I also thought that, all these refugee camps would be, breeding grounds for recruiting for extreme and violent group. The reality is that it's not happening. Why? I don't know. Because the situation of those refugees is really far from being perfect. It's really a tough life. It's complicated. But that's my guess. I still believe that you have a lot of humanitarian actors present. It's not enough, but there is something. There is really an extra effort to provide education. There is a presence. I'm sure that there is also a security apparatus around this, yes, making sure that it's not happening, but I don't think it would be enough. I think there is also something else, and I'm not sure about this something else.
Is there also a sense of community among the refugees that they have escaped this horrible thing and they don't want it to happen to the children who are in their care?
I'm not sure about that, because we also, it depends where the refugees are, but some of them are very bitter. Some of them are, the wives and sons of, fighters who died in Syria. And in their eyes, rightly or not, they feel betrayed. I'm not saying that it's right or wrong. I'm just saying that many people I met, especially in the area where the ICRC is working, it would be a perfect place for recruitment.
Yeah.
But it's not happening.
That's quite interesting.
There is some, so I'm getting different data. Because I was looking at all of the groups, there were a few camps in Syria. These were refugee camps. And I mentioned that there were a few Palestinians who had been involved. They were recruited in the refugee camp. It's also important to know that the refugee camps are targets. So, for example, the refugee camps next to Nigeria in Chad have been targeted by Boko Haram. And Dion Searcy from the New York Times has a fantastic story where a girl who was with a suicide belt, ready to blow up, she went into the camp with a colleague, because they very often travel in twos, and she saw her family. And she stopped, and she dropped the bomb, and she said, "No, I'm not blowing up." And so on the one hand, the story tells us that the refugee camps are not just a source for recruitment, but they may also be a target. But it also shows that even the children have some, and they can exercise agency. They can say no. And it's very important that as we think about these things creatively, the stigma that Francesca was talking about, we have to disaggregate this a little bit. But I'm going to say one last thing to be controversial. I actually don't think a child can be radicalized. I don't believe that a young child fully comprehends, and I've been working now with the Refugee Trauma Center at Boston Children's Hospital and Heidi Ellis at Harvard for years now. These children don't understand. They are parroting what they hear the adults around them say. And it's really very much this idea that a child is radicalized. It doesn't sit with me. I think that they can be coerced, they can be brainwashed, they can be pushed in a direction, but by the same token, they can also be pulled back.
How young though? 15, 16, 17?
So this is interesting because I was telling Fabrizio about the study we did. What happens is, and this is again coming from Africa, if the child is very, very young, the trauma that they experience, they can forget. If the child is older, which is counterintuitive to what he was saying about the 11-year-olds, they can go back and hearken to happy memories of their childhood. The ones that are most at risk are the ones who only have memories of the trauma. And so it's a U-shaped curve in terms of the opportunities to intervene. It doesn't mean we should give up on the 11-year-olds, but it means that interestingly enough, the 16-year-old may have a better chance of rehabilitation than the 12-year-old. I see someone's nodding along with me. I appreciate your validation.
Well, Akinola has a question. Akinola Locho has a question for Rohan. He's saying he'd like to know if Rohan observes any useful linkages between historical identity and violent extremism, or perhaps the rehabilitation of violent extremism. I mean, if we can go back to the Sri Lanka example, the historical identity was very much part of the motivation for some of these people to get into extremist behavior. Can it also be turned around and make it an excuse for them to come out?
Yes, absolutely. It is so important to use what is called co-ethnics and co-religionists who are mainstream moderate, who value coexistence and toleration, to work on them rather than getting people from other communities. So it is selecting the right people. You said something very interesting. You said, you highlighted the challenges of battlefield rehabilitation. It is very complex. Off the battlefield rehabilitation is much more easy. Off the battlefield rehab is basically building a good rapport with the terrorists. And I want to share just one example, because Ali Sufan is here. He is a great rehabilitator. He came across a man who was from Al-Qaeda, very important Al-Qaeda operative. Maybe I will not mention his name. Can I mention his name? Abu Zubaydah.
Can he mention Abu Zubaydah's name?
Abu Zubaydah is the first high-value detainee.
Yes.
And because of him, the world knew that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was the 9/11 mastermind. Ali Sufan worked on him. He was shot in the groin, the lower abdomen. Ali Sufan cleaned everything, Gave him food, gave him antibiotics, looked after him. He never told me this story. So I want to share with you, then Abu Zubaydah cooperated with him. So it is so important, rather than trying to change someone's mind, the way to the heart is through the stomach. You have to look after those people. If you have to give them some hope. So, and patience is the most important thing in rehab. If you are patient, even the most hardcore people, after some time, you can transform them.
That's a perfect off-ramp for us. I want to thank you for all your patience. And thank you to the organizers for organizing this amazing conference, Ali and your team at the Sufan Group, Georgetown University, Kias. Thank you everyone for joining this panel, and please join me in a round of applause for the best panel at the conference.